Welcome back. There have been concerns with the number of state-owned firearms that are lost in the system. Some of these weapons have found their ways into the hands of criminals and have committed serious crimes with them. According to the Institute for Security Studies, the South African Police Service needs to focus on firearm crime and violence to achieve public safety. So joining us is Chad Thomas from the IRS Forensic Investigations. Chad, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I guess if we could start by just going back to basics. When we're saying that these firearms are being lost, how do you lose them?
Very good evening to you and good evening to the viewers. Look, a lot of these firearms are stolen from police officers while they're on duty, also while they're off duty. Police officers themselves become a target for criminals because of the very fact that they carry firearms. We see this playing out in other industries as well, where security officers have been targeted for their firearms, and we've seen that during CIT heists and other armed robberies, firearms are taken from the scene as well by criminals. So this is a massive problem in South Africa in terms of the proliferation of small arms for use by criminal syndicates.
So there are those cases, and it's just really unfortunately so, where they are, of course, targeting police officers as well. But we also know of historical cases where police officers have been involved. One thinks of the Prinsloo case. One thinks, of course, linked to the Norwood case as well, where all those firearms went missing some years ago. Would we say that it's more of a case of these firearms being stolen from police officers while they're on and off duty, or more of a case, or an increasing case of police officers also being involved in the theft of these illegal firearms?
So when one looks at the figures, especially with respect to firearms that have gone missing from police armories or police evidence lockers, that's where the greatest concern lies. You spoke about Colonel Prinsloo. Back in 2016, he pleaded guilty to having stolen firearms and provided them to various criminal syndicates around the country, more specifically to the Cape Flats, where we know firearm violence is at an all-time high. And then, of course, you mentioned Norwood Police Station, where it was discovered through a forensic test that a firearm that should have been destroyed actually was traced back to the armory of Norwood, where a further 178 firearms had gone missing. But those aren't really reported. Those firearms have been recovered from crime scenes. Those firearms were handed in at the advent of the millennium in 2000, when the new Firearms Act came into being, and a lot of people didn't want to apply with the new rigorous standards that were applicable in the application of firearms. And then, of course, we've had firearm amnesties over the years where people have handed in their firearms. So when we hear of firearms reported as stolen or from the state specifically, that doesn't take into consideration the weapons that have already been handed in or may be kept in custody of the police for the use for forensics for destruction, that have somehow made their way back onto the streets.
So if we had to include that, we're looking at a much bigger picture and a very scary picture, wouldn't you say, Chad?
Look, the proliferation of small arms by criminal syndicates in South Africa is of grave concern. We live in one of the most violent societies in the world, and a lot of the violence is associated with firearms, whether it is to threaten somebody, to extort somebody, whether it is to maim somebody, or whether it's to kill somebody. We have exceptionally high rates of murder. We have the added aspect of murder for hire. We have kidnap for ransom. We have ATM robberies. We have CIT heists. All of this is carried out by organized criminals that are armed to the teeth. And these arms have to be coming from somewhere, so we have to look from where they come. Now, this particular study that's come out from the ISS says that a certain amount of weapons do come from the police, and this is primarily through theft or through the murder of police officers where the firearms are taken from them. But firearms are also proliferated through other means. We've got caches that have been left over from the remnants of the Liberation War. We had a lot of weapons come across our borders in the 80s, going into the early 90s. Of course, we still have firearms and explosives coming across the border. But then, of course, there's the weapons that have been taken for destruction that most probably haven't landed up being destroyed, like we saw in the Norwood scenario, like we saw with the disgraced ex-Colonel Prinsloo, who was supplying organized crime syndicates. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that living in a violent society, we need to make sure that crime intelligence is in somehow um, ca capacitated to be able to figure out where these weapons are coming from and how they've been distributed and even rented out in some instances to these various organized crime syndicates.
Rented out by who exactly?
So that's a tough one. We've heard of police officers that have been arrested for lending out firearms. We've also heard of security companies that have been established by criminals themselves or criminal syndicates. Now, when one looks at the security industry, it's massive. It's bigger than the police, the correctional services, and the army combined. And we're hearing that just like you have a few bad apples that exist within the police that either sell weapons or rent out weapons, the same applies in the security industry. You must remember, if you have a taxi boss that fears for his life, he hires private security officers as bodyguards. The rival taxi boss does the same thing. When there's an argument, they get those two different security companies to fight one another in a proxy war. Those guys are actually carrying legitimate licensed firearms. But in some instances, those firearms fall into the wrong hands, or they rent them out specifically to kidnap for ransom syndicates, CRT syndicates, and murder for hire syndicates.
And Chad, when one looks at the numbers of private security, they obviously outnumber the number of SAPS members on the ground as well. So then that would pose even a bigger risk, because if we're saying that those who are law enforcement is being targeted for their firearms, and then you've got this huge number of private security that is needed because there's just not enough capacity and boots on the ground to fight all crimes by the SAPS, that also brings in the private security industry into the fore here.
Yeah, it does. Of course, when one looks at any organization or any industry where there's firearms, it's easy to then target specific individuals for those firearms. So we've heard of SANDF members in the past targeted for their firearms. We know that security officers are targeted for their firearms. So are police officers. And this is of grave concern because it just shows the brazenness of these criminal syndicates who want to get far more firepower, and they won't stop at anything to get it. We've heard of actual police stations being robbed of their firearms.
Quite often, we also see reports and statements from the SAPS where they've had successful operations and they've had arrests and they've retrieved and confiscated firearms and ammunition. Thinking about just how it is properly, the records are kept as well and monitored. With the successes of such arrests, is it kind of almost cutting their nose to spite their face? Because if you have these successful arrests and you're able to confiscate these firearms, but then you aren't able to secure them and properly keep records, then what's the point? Where are we failing here?
Somewhere along the line, there's a failure in the system. The Firearms Control Act, which came into effect in 2000, is strictly regulated and monitored by SAPS. And lawful firearm owners in the civilian context have to apply for the renewal of their firearms every 5 years. It's the proliferation of the illicit market that is of extreme concern. And you point out that what happens to these weapons once they're taken off the streets. And then, of course, we have the analogies that get drawn with the disgraced colonel who dealt specifically in firearms that he gave across to criminal syndicates, but was in a very trusted position of ensuring that those firearms were correctly registered and then sent for destruction, which never, of course, happened. So somewhere along the line, in terms of the checks and balances, there was a problem. We saw it play out again with Norwood, with 178 firearms that landed up back on the streets. So we need to ensure that, of course, our police are capacitated, that the inspectorate is capacitated, and that there's some kind of oversight. The thin blue wall is important to protect us as the citizens, but at times they also protect themselves. So we should also give consideration to independent oversight over the firearms that are in the hands of the state, as well as weapons that are meant to be destroyed. And there should also be some kind of oversight there when that destruction takes place.
Chad, before I let you go, when we look at the assassination of Colonel Charles Kinnear in the Western Cape, who was part of the anti-gang unit, and he had been doing a lot of work in terms of investigating illegal firearms, and we saw what happened in that case, and he got assassinated. Is there enough of a message, a strong message being sent out to say that our job is to investigate this and we will protect our own and avoid the likes of the disgraced Prinsloo, for instance?
Yeah, there's definitely new energy within the police force, especially with the appointment of Minister Mkhunu as the minister. When one listens to what the National Commissioner Fani Masemola has to say, when one looks at the actions of the Gauteng Commissioner, Mtombela, the Western Cape Commissioner, Patakile, and of course the KZN Commissioner, we see that they are now taking the fight to the criminals. It's very important for the police to stamp their authority. At the same time, we can't allow for extrajudicial killings, and that's most probably not what is happening at this point in time. But if we don't find some kind of societal change when it comes to violent crime in South Africa, we are going to see, like we saw in South America, far more vigilantism and extrajudicial killings taking place. What General Konazi is doing on the ground is admirable, because they are fighting fire with fire, which we saw the previous policing under Becky Cele seemed quite hesitant, despite the rhetoric that we heard from Becky Cele. But it's critical that our police have our support, but at the same time, while stamping their authority, they don't overstep their bounds.
Thank you so much for your time this evening, Chad Thomas, and also your insights.